Don't forget to have fun. We get all serious and professional and you have these plans and goals and stuff. And yes, that is all very important, but remember to enjoy yourself. Think about it, Matty. When I was young and I dreamed of one day I would be a writer and one day I would tell stories and people would listen to my stories. I never dreamed that I would actually be able to talk about what I do with such passion. And I take every opportunity I can to enjoy having those conversations.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author podcast, I talk with Mark Leslie Lefebvre about the topic of our new book, The Podcast Guest Playbook, Turning Conversations into Connections and Community, which launches on June 11th. We discuss tips and strategies for being an effective podcast guest, emphasizing the importance of understanding the host's perspective, making the process as easy as possible for the host, and focusing on the value you can provide to the audience. If you do that, the benefits will accrue to you naturally. We highlight the importance of the 3 Ps, professionalism, preparedness, and politeness, throughout the process, and share personal anecdotes and practical advice to help creators get the most out of their podcast guest appearances. And now, let's hear from Mark Lefebvre and me talk about how to develop your podcast guest playbook. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Hey, Mark, how are you doing?
Hey, Matty. Always great to chat with you.
It is always lovely to have you here. And this is where normally I would read a little bio about you, but you have been a guest so many times on the podcast that my new policy is when I have a repeat guest like you, I ask them to share one fact about themselves that the listeners might not otherwise know.
That's a fun one, actually.
Yeah, I've gotten some fun information.
Wow. What is something that your listeners might not know about me? Have I ever shared, and I don't know if I've shared just how much of a huge fan I am of Cheers, particularly since this is the week that George Wendt just passed on.
Yeah.
And one of my bucket list items was to have a beer with Norm from Cheers growing up. You know, because when the show actually was first released, I was underage, significantly underage. But I grew up on the show, and my dream was to have a beer with Norm. I did have a beer with George Wendt at Hamilton Comic-Con years ago. I have a picture of it. It has a place of pride in my bar, just like my wedding photo has a place of pride in my office.
You and your wife, and you and Norm.
And Liz and I met at a brewery, so beer is a big part of our lives. And the only other bucket list item that I have sort of related to beer would be to actually go and visit the Bull and Finch pub, the Cheers in Boston, where they actually filmed all the outside shots for that show.
Oh, interesting. And you have not, I guess you haven't made that pilgrimage yet?
I've never been to Boston yet. So if I get to Boston, I mean, unless I'm on a layover at the airport, and I don't think Boston's a big layover place. It's not like Chicago work or something like that, or Denver. But I think if I get to Boston, that's going to be number 1 on my list.
I would think so. I think you're going to have to make a special trip while you're still near the East Coast.
I know, a pilgrimage to Boston.
Yes, exactly. Let me know when I'll meet up with you.
Yeah, because it's not that far, right?
It's a train trip.
It's not that far. Like, I think I can get there in about 14 hours if I drive. Maybe less time if I speed.
Yes, if you're really desperate to get there.
Yeah.
Well, I invited Mark on the podcast because we wanted to talk about the topic of our book, The Podcast Guest Playbook, Turning Conversations into Connections and Community. And what we're going to be doing is, as longtime podcast hosts and as frequent podcast guests, we're just going to walk through some of the sort of stages that a person goes through as they're pitching and preparing for and executing on podcast interviews. And we're each going to share a tip for each category that we've come up with. And I think that the first thing that I wanted to talk about was just to take a step back from that and say, what was it about the podcasting guest experience that made you want to be part of this? And then I'll share what made me think of the idea in the first place.
Well, it's kind of two-tiered because I have two, and then you have 2 brands too. So it's always funny when a question like that is like, as an industry person, wanting to be a guest was to talk about the cool things that I wanted to talk about before self-publishing was a thing. Started with print on demand and digital publishing, and then it became ebooks, and then it specifically was about Kobo and blah, 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 blah. As a writer, on the flip side, it was the opportunity to actually reach people who might be interested in hearing a bit of the behind the scenes of the kinds of things that I wrote. I guess in both cases, it's kind of the same. but just with two different brands in mind.
Yeah, well, I mean, all the things you're saying about the incentive for being on a podcast, I completely agree with. And for me, the incentive of wanting to write a book about it is that I would often see either myself, looking back on my own podcast guest appearances, and I would say, oh, I wish I had done something differently. Or as the host, I would be getting pitches from people, or I would be hosting them on my podcast. And there seemed to be this sort of pool of tips that I wanted to share. And I thought, this is an easy pitfall to avoid. And if I could just get the word out about how to avoid this easy pitfall, I wanted to do that. And then as we worked through this, I realized that there were other things that were maybe not quite as simple. They weren't necessarily the low-hanging fruit, but they were still really important. Yeah. And I just felt as if having a resource that I could provide to people that would say, here's a way to pave the way to having this experience and avoiding some of the uh-ohs that I had done myself or that I had seen my guests doing.
Yeah, and I think that's an important element when we think about what we put into the book, because a lot of it was drawn upon our own experiences. A lot of it was drawn upon, as a podcast host, here's something I wish I'd known. Here's something I wish my guests had known. Maybe I could have prepared them better for that. But then also as a guest yourself, here are expectations I had, and here's the reality.
Right. Yeah.
And I think we have spent quite a bit of time in trying to make sure that we provide a realistic perspective for readers. There's positives and there's negatives. We showed the warts as much as we could without scaring people away from the whole thing.
And steering people toward the guest appearances that are going to make the most sense for them based on their professional goals and their personal preferences and all those kinds of things.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the first category that I wanted to talk about, that each of us should share something that is a tip that we would like our listeners to know, is understanding the host perspective. So we start out the book saying it's helpful for you to know what's going on the other side of the mic. And of those things we shared, what is something that you would want to say? If you were at a conference, you were speaking to someone and they said that they were an author and they were interested in getting on podcast appearances, and you wanted to share one fact about the host perspective, what would it be?
I think I want to make sure that their desire is to share something that's going to be of value to my audience, which are writers. And fortunately, writers are invested in a lot of different knowledge areas. And it's not about selling a book so much as it is about sharing some sort of expertise that's going to benefit the audience. Now, if that works properly and effectively, if the giving of that information is valuable and interesting, or the way you relay the story is interesting as a storyteller, the book will sell itself. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So that's the thing I want to, I guess if I had to sum it up, is don't worry about selling, worry about giving.
Yes. Yeah, I think that idea of going into that interaction with a service mindset, not a sales mindset, is key.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, Matty. That's perfect.
Yeah. I think the thing that I would share, the one tip I would share about understanding the host perspective is that I would say the vast majority of podcast hosts are doing this as a labor of love. And so although it is possible to gain, financial benefits to monetize podcasts to a certain extent, I think that for most people, if you took a podcast host and you calculated how much money they're making for monetization against the hours they spend, they'd be making like 17 cents an hour.
If that. That's a lot. Yeah. That's a lot. No, I do it for the fame, Matty.
Yes, exactly. The adulation. And I think that's important to understand because I think it enables potential guests to bring a more realistic view to what that interaction is going to be like if they realize that it's usually a volunteer effort, it's usually a labor of love. And so you can't really interact with a podcast host the way you could interact, let's say, with a service provider. I think a perfect example of this is authors who are looking to schedule podcast appearances around a book launch. And they're like, I want to talk to you and I want the podcast episode to air on such and such a date. And realizing that is very, very difficult for a podcast host to do for all sorts of reasons, but it shouldn't even really be a demand that you're making. You shouldn't be making demands. You should be extending, as you were saying, extending that hand to have something to offer.
Yeah, because it's not like you've logged into a written word media dashboard and you're saying, okay, I want to schedule it for this day and then
Right.
this is coming out that day. No, I mean, and there's an existing schedule. Just like, for example, I mean, your podcast has a regular schedule that you stick to and you release the podcast consistently on that day. You're not going to move it to
Yeah.
launch day for someone. And probably like myself, you have a lot of interviews in the queue and you're way more organized than I am. So you have them probably planned out and structured way further in advance. Whereas I have a lot of interviews in advance. And then I get to that week's show and go, this one.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And there are all sorts of considerations, like I cover both the writing craft and the publishing voyage. And if I see that I've done like several craft related ones in a row, and I think maybe it's time to mix it
Yeah.
up and do one that's business related, I want the flexibility to do that in order to serve my
yeah.
listeners
Or if
best.
I've had, 5 mystery writers that I've interviewed in a batch, I don't want like all 5 weeks in a row to be mystery writers. I might want to throw a fantasy writer in or throw a poet. You know what I mean? Like shake it up a little bit so that the different people can get something from it. It is always fun to have craft this week and business and this, because it provides, I don't know, it's like a buffet of flavors.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And there could be all sorts of other things going on behind the scenes. A host might have edited and queued up a whole bunch of episodes because they know they're just not going to have any bandwidth during a certain month or whatever it is. There are a million and one reasons. And so not expecting it to be like an interaction with a service provider, I think, is the tip I would share on the understanding the host perspective front.
Oh, I love that.
So another important category of the playbook is identifying your targets. What is the tip you would like to share with listeners about identifying your targets as a potential podcast guest?
Well, I think listening to the podcast to just get a feel for the host themselves, for their interview style. And usually within that, whether it's the interview portion or the other portions, there's usually introductory portions and other segments to an episode. Does what I offer align with this host's style? And it doesn't have to be aligned 100%, but as long as it's not at cross purposes with that, right? So that's one of the elements. Then the other element is making sure that, well, again, it's an interview and ideally it's a bit organic, even if the questions are pre-planned and shared ahead of time. Organized podcast hosts will do that. They'll share the questions in advance. I prefer and I warn guests, it's a more organic conversation. To that end, there are some guests who are really nervous and are not comfortable having not an unscripted conversation, but an unplanned. And they want to see the questions in advance. So what I do in that case, when they let me know that, is I'll prepare a bunch of questions and say, here's what I think I'm going to ask you. I can't promise that we're not going to divert from it. Because if you say something really cool and you talk about some whatever thing, I might want to go down that path with you because I think it'll be fun. So here's the script, but we may go off. So that sort of preparedness on both sides is really important.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing in terms of identifying your targets that you can only learn by listening to the podcast episodes. And if you are uncomfortable, then looking for those ones that maybe are a little more scripted. Like I know that there are some very good podcasts that always ask the same questions. And so it's not rote because the conversation that stems from those questions is always different and is driven by, the holistic conversation that the guest and the hosts are having. But going into that, knowing that this is the question you need to answer, I think can be helpful for people. People might identify targets based on whether or not video is shared. I mean, I think there are some people who are uncomfortable on video. And so if you're early in your podcast guesting career and you want to find those ones that don't publish video, although those are becoming increasingly rare, so you're really limiting yourself if you do that. But just that understanding of experiencing the podcasts and then matching them to the goals you're looking for.
Yeah, no, that is a good one because there are guests who are very shy about saying, you're not going to share the video, are you? It's like, well, not if you don't want me to. You're my guest. I'm going to treat you like a guest. I mean, unless it's if it's a video specific podcast, which mine isn't.
But I do think that asking a host, this is kind of going back to understanding the host perspective, asking a host to make an exception is not a good plan. Like if you're doing your research and you see that they have a YouTube channel and they're putting videos up, maybe even if
Yeah.
they don't promote them heavily, and you see that all their episodes have video to go with it, then you should be
Yeah.
asking for an exception to that rule. It's
Yeah.
probably going to be posted.
I mean, unless it's part of your shtick, like the unknown comic, and then you put like a paper bag over your head.
Yes.
With air holes, of course.
We'll probably figure that most of our listeners are looking for exposure, not like the secret author. So I think
about Aaron Wright. I just want to use this example. Aaron Wright, before Aaron started doing in-person appearances and stuff like that, the early interviews I did with her, and she was the founder of Wide for the Win, we didn't know what Aaron looked like. We knew what her voice was, and she just had this logo of a woman drinking from a big giant latte cup. And that was Aaron, for all we knew.
Yeah.
So the interviews that she had done, we didn't know what she looked like, because again, that was part of her brand, but she didn't want to dilute her brand because that was her author brand.
Yeah.
And now she has the author brand that's now separate from the Aaron who does stuff with authors. But that could be a reason. And I was fine. Again, I'm not a video kind of person, but I remember early interviews with her where I think I knew what she looked like because I had seen her, but when the cameras were rolling, the video came off.
Yeah. Well, just recognize that if you are going to be sticking to that, if, the sort of anonymous persona is part of your brand, then you're going to be limiting yourself to a certain extent in terms of the podcasts that you're going to be successful in pitching yourself to if you put it out there as I'm sorry, you can't publish video of me.
Yeah. I mean, the more restrictions you have, the less likely someone's going to say yes.
Exactly. And I would say in terms of identifying your targets, my tip for this category would be, all the standard things I think anyone would say, check the search engine, do searches on your podcast player, see where your fellow experts in whatever topic it is or whatever genre it is are appearing. But I would say the other thing is consider the podcast's engagement on their platforms. And by that, I don't necessarily mean find the ones with the biggest TikTok following or whatever, because I think that the numbers are less important than the extent to which and the way they're interacting about their episodes. So, for example, if you find a podcast that has a small followership on Facebook, but a very engaged followership, and you see that the host is posting every time there's a new episode, they're posting about it, their followers are commenting, they're interacting with their followers on those comments. I think that a small engaged audience makes a more attractive target for your pitches than a large but maybe less engaged host and podcast.
I say the same for your author newsletter list. I'd rather have a smaller engaged list than a whole bunch of deadbeat freegans who just signed up for a free book and don't want to engage.
Yeah, definitely quality over quantity when it comes to assessing the podcasts that you want to pitch yourself to.
Yeah, for sure.
So the next sort of big category that we're going to be sharing is making your pitch. So what is something that you as a podcast host would like to share with people who are making podcast pitches?
Again, the pitch is about the value that you're going to bring to that community, not about you. Now, they can mix and mingle. You are bringing the value to the community because of this experience you have or what you've written about or the research you've done or whatever element it is that you want to share. That's the thing that I look at when I'm looking at a pitch. It's not just this carbon cutout bullet point form that anyone can just send to 500 places at once, but looking specifically at what will this specifically offer a value to my audience. Because my audience is important. These are people who are members of a community who I've sort of curated. I've scared some off over the years. I've attracted others, right? Like it's a very specific community of people who find value in it. And I want to continue to deliver that value. So I hope that the person who wants to come on the podcast isn't just coming there. Again, I want them to feel like they would be welcome back. Rather than just like this, a stop on the tour and I'm never going to see this town again. I want the audience to feel like that guest is part of that community, even if it's just for one episode.
Yeah, I think that the fact that you're returning to that theme of what value do you bring to the listeners is super important, because you can't go into this thinking, what do I want to get out of this? I want to get more book sales and more royalties. You have to go into it with what do I have to share with the people who are following this podcast? And then the book sales and the royalties follow on, but the book sales and the royalties can't be the focus.
For sure. For sure. It's like an organic element that will happen naturally if it happens where it happens. And
Yeah.
you're just creating the conditions by which it may happen.
Yeah. And I think my tip for making your pitch would be that making it easy for the host is always a good idea. And that can take a number of different forms. One is to include links. It's very frustrating to get a pitch for someone, and I'm reading through it, and it sounds really interesting. And now I want to learn more about them, and there's not a link in sight. So now I'm going on to Google, and I'm trying to find their author page, or I'm trying to find their social media accounts, or whatever that may be. And the more work you make the host do, the more likely it is that it's not going to result in a yes. So I think that there are just standard pieces of information you should always link to. You should always link to your website. You should provide easy links to your social media. You should link to a bio. Ideally, you should link to a page where a host can download a headshot. If you get an invitation out of this pitch, if you have done other podcast interviews and you can provide links to those to illustrate that this is a format you're comfortable with and you know how to deliver a good interview, that's great. And if you haven't done any interviews, if this is your first outing, then I highly recommend having a 1 or 2 minute sort of demo reel that is not intended to fool anybody into thinking that you've been on a podcast, but just a minute or two of you talking about the topic that you're proposing, so that the person can see that you're comfortable on camera, you're comfortable with the audio, you're comfortable with the experience. If you're going for interview style podcasts, then maybe you even enlist a friend to help you make that demo reel. But it's just something to indicate to the host that you know what you're doing, you know what you're talking about, you're comfortable in the format, and making all that as easily accessible as possible.
Oh, for sure. And a trick that I learned through a speakers association was when you're doing that, just to that style, if somebody's looking for additional tips, you get a little stick, a little wooden stick, maybe a ruler, and you draw a little face. Could just be whatever. You don't have to be an artist. Draw a smiley face. Put it off to the side of your computer camera. And then you can have the written questions there, like, why did you feel like writing this novel was important now? And then you have a perfect answer. And you look right at that face as if you're talking to someone. This is especially if you can't enlist a friend, or the friend wants to be off camera and doesn't want their voice to be heard. And that's where, when you do the video, you can at least superimpose the question or put it underneath. So you've got that, 30 seconds of you answering that perfect. So that way you've got a demo reel that someone can actually see, oh, this is Mark answering this particular question, and he's talking to that guy over there.
Yeah.
Whoever that was. The 60-minute style interview.
Well, one thing that I've seen, I've gotten a couple of times as a host, and I remember you doing similar things. For example, your Patreon patrons is a personalized video. So in the course of my host career, I have gotten a couple of videos where I open up a link to YouTube or whatever. There's a private video out there and says, "Hi, Matty, I'm so-and-so, and I love the Indy Author podcast, and I would love to come on to talk about this topic because I think it would be a great tie-in to this other episode that you just did, and I know that your listeners are interested." I have to say, a personalized video is very attention-getting.
Well, they talk about the previous episodes. So obviously they're listening, and they put some effort into it. And to be quite honest, it doesn't take that long to do a short video. We all have easy access to doing quick.
Yes.
We're usually walking around with these things.
And even if you sort of script it out and you use, as I don't want to say, we're both trying to avoid the word scripted out, but bullet out, let's say, if you bullet out what you want to say, you record that personalized video. And then at the end of the video, you say, just to give you easy access to all this information, I'm going to follow up with an email that contains this information. Then you're getting the woohoo of the personalized video. And you're also giving them an easy way, easy, always important to find you again and reach out to you and learn even more about you.
Yeah, I know. I love that. I mean, because it really calls attention to it. And you're like, okay, I got 15 emails this week of people who want to be on the show. And one of them was a video where the person addressed me, and it was only 30 seconds. That got my attention. Yeah, especially because those videos, they're done right. They show that your audio is decent. You don't have some bizarre visual thing going on in the background, whatever that might be. Well, no, it could be like the window behind me, and it's like you can't see. I look like I'm in the witness protection program.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So actually, I think that's a good lead into another of the topics we want to talk about. One of the categories that we're sharing tips about, which is building a rapport And I know when we were working on the book, I had a heck of a time figuring out where to put the building rapport part, because the way that plays out in the interview, I think is very clear. And we share tips for how to build rapport during the interview, but it's something that's sort of laced through the whole process from, the initial pitch, even beyond the interview, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But just talk a little bit about what you think of when you think about building rapport and a tip that you would share on that front.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And you're so right that it's really part of the overall relationship. Yes, it comes to the highest fruition in the evidence of the conversation. But what is it that happens beforehand? And again, that rapport could just be getting a little bit more comfortable with one another. I mean, you're going to be you, but you may readapt to the style of the show or the style of the interview, especially if they have certain segments where, like you have a new thing you do with repeat guests. Like, oh, I don't want to hear the same bio. Let us do something interesting. And there are certain ones where there's like this trivial fact to just provide. And I love that. So you build a rapport because prior to the interview, the host is giving you this homework to do, and you have an opportunity to do it. I think it all starts in that communication.
Yeah.
I've had great rapport with people who've had to change and rebook 4 or 5 times. Just because they had to rebook did not mean, oh, rats, they did it again. Oh, man, I don't like their pain in the butt to deal with. Life happens, right? Stuff happens that you can't control. And so I've had guests where it was kind of like looking forward to it. Then all of a sudden it's canceled again or gets moved and it gets moved and it gets moved and it's get moved. But that never diminished the rapport. Maybe because we clearly communicated with one another. I'm not sure what it was that made the rapport solid.
Well, it reminds me of a tip that we quote in the book from our buddy Michael Laron. I had polled my past podcast guests about what would a tip be that you would want to share with people about podcast guesting. And one of Michael's was, don't let your problems become the host's problems. And the idea that if you have to rebook, you don't want to give the host a sob story. You want to make it as businesslike as possible. And guess what? I'm using the E word again. As easy for them as possible. And so if they say, oh, yeah, well, I'm available tomorrow at the same time or something like that. And maybe that requires that you make some adjustments to your schedule, but do everything you can. You're more patient than I am. Somebody is rescheduling 4 or 5 times, but try not to make it 4 or 5 times. Try to make it as easy as possible. And don't, as Michael says, don't make your problems the host's problems.
No, I like that. I guess what I'm saying is, even when things aren't going right, you can still have rapport. That can derail rapport, but it doesn't have to.
Yeah. Well, in the book, because I know that you love alliteration. And so for building rapport, we came up with the 3 Ps of professionalism, preparedness, and politeness.
I love my Ps.
Yes. Well, it just worked out very nicely that it landed as the 3 Ps. And we've been talking a little bit about professionalism, and that is, get to the point, make it easy, include the links, understand the podcast format, all those kinds of things. What about preparedness? What is something that you would share in terms of preparedness, in terms of building rapport?
So I'm going to focus on the main interview, right? That person to person, to go with Ps.
Yes.
Personal touch is making sure that you're in a space that's not going to be interrupted. Now, you may not have ultimate control over it, but you usually can close the door, or it's not, scheduled at a time when you know that there's going to be action and noise and stuff like that. I think that's a really important element for preparedness. So like preparing your space, making sure that there's no distracting things that are going to distract you from the interview, but potentially distract the host. Because if I have like a cat walking back and forth on the shelves, you're going to be attending, because cats are interesting, right? You're going to be attending to the cat, not me.
Well, I did have the experience of being interviewed by someone once, and their cat was in the background, and it was opening the door. It's like using its little paws to turn the doorknob. And I got so distracted. I was trying to answer a question, and all what I was doing was seeing the cat turning the doorknob with its little paws. And finally it got the door open and walked out. And I had to say, do you know your cat just got out of the room?
Because the cat got up. Like, maybe it wasn't supposed to.
Maybe it wasn't supposed to, yes. So the cat in the background doing something is definitely a personal experience with that.
I mean, unless it's a podcast about living with cats, then in which case,
Then it could be very appropriate.
Yeah, it's very appropriate. Yeah. How about what are some other preparedness?
Well, I think that idea of refreshing your memory about the podcast before you record your interview. So you will have listened to it, you will be familiar with it to prepare your pitch. And so that's great, but weeks or even months might go by between the time that you do that research for the pitch and the time you need to refresh your memory for the actual interview recording or live interview, whatever it might be. And, the person has probably put out a bunch more episodes. So I think part of preparedness is going through some of the more recent ones, maybe especially look for ones where you feel like there could be some tie-ins with the topic that you want to talk about so that you can say, oh, I especially loved what so-and-so said a couple of episodes ago in such and such. That's always a super fun thing to hear a guest say when they're illustrating their familiarity with your podcast, and they're also pointing the listeners to a previous episode that you might want to promote.
That is platinum, to use a P word. That is a platinum thing that a guest can do. Refer to something that was mentioned in previous episode. I've done similar things both at in-person conferences as well as when I've done morning radio spots. You're on like 5 minutes, but if you're listening to the show earlier, you can pick up on something the hosts were talking about. And if you can include that, it creates continuity for the listener, and it's a really powerful tool. I've even done such things as referring to a talk that everyone saw that morning in the main room.
Yeah.
By attending to something there and then pulling it in and sort of reaffirming something that someone else said in your own perspective.
Yeah.
So I think that can play obviously for podcasts, but I think it's something you can do in other areas as well once you've perfected podcast technique.
Yeah, and I think that these kinds of references to things outside whatever your thing is that you're trying to promote are great because it does make it more conversational. It makes it less salesy and more conversational, which I think is what every host wants a guest who they're going to be able to have a conversation with, not be monologued at by.
That conversation, I know this is a bit of a divergent, but when you mention conversation, to me, that's so important because I've had the experience of interviewing guests where they don't converse. They have really short 1 or 2 word answers. It's kind of like, talking to my preteen or trying to talk to my preteen and just getting 1 word answers. And you're like, well, this isn't much of a conversation. I'm asking a question. It's like, yes. It's meant to be a conversation, not to be an interrogation.
Yes. Well, I think that that's a great point because it's easy to overemphasize the idea that as a guest, you don't want to get on there and just sometimes you have those for information about my book, hit 1, and then they have a 7-minute pitch. Yeah, the 7-minute spiel, which you definitely don't want to do. But as you're pointing out, the opposite is also true, that you are going into this with a responsibility to uphold your side of the conversation and to share interesting information and to serve the listeners and the host. And you don't do that by being a person of few words.
Yeah. I mean, being an international man of mystery work for some places, but definitely not for podcasts, especially, when you're thinking about the audio medium.
Exactly. I think this is actually a good entree to the third P, which is politeness. And just the idea, I think a really easy way to act on politeness beyond maybe all the many more obvious things that we could talk about is to periodically leave a moment for the other person to say something. This is a tip that I try to exercise for myself, both as a host and a guest. Having moments in the conversation where everybody can kind of regroup, and if the person wants to jump in with something, giving them an opportunity to do that. That would just be a very sort of simple example of politeness. But I think there's also this perspective of you want to be your best self whenever you're engaging in one of these interactions. And so are there any examples that you'd like to share, pro or con, about that idea of politeness and being your best self on the interview?
Well, I think it's an important aspect of trying to be in a distraction-free environment so that you are not distracted when your host or your guest is talking, you're actually attending to what they're saying. And that could include some nonverbal cues, nodding, smiling appropriately, not inappropriately. Like it's just someone shares something devastating, heartbreaking, and you like a big grin. But I mean, right now, I'll give you a perfect example from live from this podcast. Before we started the podcast, I did not close my window. And so I'm distracted by the sounds in the street outside. I have a Monty Python Ministry of Silly Walk sign encouraging people to do silly walks. So there's a lot of laughter and people going by. And because I can see, I want to see what silly walk they're doing. I'm hearing that while we're doing the interview. And like the rudest thing I could do while Matty's talking is look over there. So there's a live example of me not being prepared. And because of that, that could have led to me not being polite in this conversation.
Well, it's a great point to have some kind of checklist to go through. That's probably another good tip for preparedness. I have a little set of things at the top of my notes for my podcast interviews when I'm the host that is, put on Do Not Disturb, close Outlook because Outlook, for some reason, thinks it's exempt from Do Not Disturb.
It always is. Anything that's Microsoft meant.
Yeah, it doesn't apply to me. Things are binging in the background. Make sure I've selected the right microphone, the right earbuds, and so on. And so just having
or phone on Do Not Disturb, even
phone on Do Not Disturb, exactly. Yeah, and I think that I would say very rare circumstance, which is still useful to be prepared for, is when things aren't going well with a host, and there have been times, very few, where I've been interacting with someone as the host. And it's clear that they didn't expect it to be interactive. They get flustered because they thought they were just on to do their bid. Or if I've been on somebody else's podcast and there's something about it that I didn't see coming, I've forgotten about it from my research or whatever it is. Even more rarely, the idea when a podcast conversation starts getting a little confrontational. Now, you may be an author who would welcome that. There are going to be, topics and genres where confrontational is probably exactly what you're looking for. But if it's not, then you will have weeded that out through the research process. But just that idea that even if the person you're speaking with, even if the host starts becoming unprofessional, you don't serve yourself by doing anything other than responding to that with professionalism and politeness. I know you have some examples about this. Do you share any of them?
Yeah, I mean, I've had that several times as a guest on live radio. I've had an example where I was recognized only after the booking had happened that I was not talking to the right audience, which I would have prepared different examples that would have made more sense. But I remember once with a host who would throw a question out, and it's meant to be a conversation, and then would just get up and walk out of the room while I was talking. Go and
that
do
is
things
so weird.
And it was just so disconcerting. And I was kind of like, am I boring this guy? Does he have better things to do? And so when I'm there meant to perform and deliver content that I believe that they wanted, because they're the ones who wanted me on the show, I'm felt like, it's like when you're in a live audience and they're doing anything else but actually paying attention to what you're doing on the stage. You're like, well, what am I doing here? I mean, self-doubt's bad enough for us authors. The imposter syndrome and self-doubt is already bad enough. I don't need to have a host throw it in my face in a big way, because I struggle enough with feeling like, am I delivering enough good content? And obviously I'm not, because dude's not even paying attention to me.
Yeah. I do want to say that kind of situation, I mean, I've conducted or participated in hundreds of interviews. I know the same is true for you times 10. And those kind of circumstances are so rare. I don't want to scare anybody away by giving what is a very, very bizarre example of the guy actually kind of walking off screen while you were talking to him.
No, and it's good. And thank you for mentioning that, Matty. But the other thing, my response wasn't, hey, what are you doing? My response was, I just kept going.
Yeah.
Because for all I knew, the people would be listening and they wouldn't be able to tell, or they wouldn't be watching the video. They'd just be listening. And so he asked a question. So I'm going to answer that question to the best of my ability, even though it was really difficult to keep focused. Like you were looking at the cat opening the door, but it wasn't a humorous situation. It was more of a frustrating internal self-doubt situation. But I still managed to say, no, you're here to do this. Keep doing this. No, I mean, I did make a point to my publicist and I said, no more. Never will I go on that show again.
Yeah. Well, and that was good information for that person to know for their other clients as well.
For their other guests too. Yeah. Other clients. It's like, well, they just know what you're getting into.
Yeah. I think that a more common situation to have to deal with professionalism, preparedness, and politeness is the scenario where the host is unprepared. And so I think in those circumstances, especially if you know you have this opportunity, but you're going to be taking on more of the work, be prepared to do that. And so if the person asks a very generic question, in a way, this is your free ticket to take this conversation wherever you want to, trying to solicit interaction, trying to, either take them along in that direction or elicit some response that indicates that they want to go somewhere else, but go into it knowing, is this going to be a comfortable, free-flowing conversation, or am I going to have to do more work in order to make this really valuable for the listeners?
Yeah. I mean, I always look at those as a challenge, especially if it's like, okay, I always ask the same 5 questions. I'm like, man, well, what can I do to provide some dynamic element to the answers?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can throw something out there that's going to make someone sit up and go, wait a second, I was expecting that.
Exactly.
And I mean, being professional while doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you get some sense from them that that's not the direction you want to go in, then you kind of lob the ball back to them and see if you can get some hints about where they'd like to go.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about delivering your interview. I think in the process of the conversation about building rapport, we kind of covered that one. But the other thing that I love to talk about, because I think this is maybe the least appreciated and most potentially valuable part of podcast appearances, is amplifying your appearance. And it's all the things you do after the red, live, or record light goes off. Yeah. So if you were going to give somebody a tip about amplifying your appearance, what would it be?
Amplify your appearance. Like, don't just assume that the host is going to do all of the work. Often, with many of the productions, the host is the producer, is the booker, is the whatever, right? It's a one-person operation. Like you said before, they're doing this as a labor of love. It's something they're very passionate about, and it's not their full-time job. It's not like a radio host who has a team working with them. Share the links, share and tag them on social media. I also, every interview, I've tried to put every single interview I've ever done, whether it's been, print or text-based or audio or video or whatever, on my author page. And the minute I get it from the host, I'll go back and update the author page and say, okay, so on May 26th, here's the YouTube video, here's the link to the main podcast show note link or wherever, you know what I mean? Like, I try not to link to any one specific place because people listen to podcasts everywhere. I try to link to the main one, actually making it easier for there to be a main one. Some people just send me to this one obscure place that I was like, I'm not sending people.
Yeah.
Nobody listens on that platform. So that, I know it seems so rudimentary, but it's so important, because this is your chance as the guest to show and share something about your brilliance. And I'm going to stand behind the fact that you're an awesome person. You've written a book. You've done some really awesome things as an author or creative person, and you want the world to benefit from experiencing you in engaging in conversation about it. That's kind of cool. That's a gift to them.
Yeah.
Share it. Make sure people see it. Send it to your audience. Amplify it. When you see the host share it on social media, if they tag you, reshare it. That goes a long way.
Yeah. And I think even looking for opportunities, in addition to sharing, actually commenting, trying to engage the people who are following them on platforms where they can interact. Actually, a tip that I meant to mention is the idea in preparing, and I think this is one that you had come up with, the idea of, if the host has like show notes or whatever related to their podcast on a platform that takes comments, you can learn an awful lot about your audience by looking through the comments. I thought that was a fantastic suggestion. And you can see things like, if I'm going to be on a podcast talking about podcasting for authors, and I'm wondering are these people going to be interested in like tech stuff or conversational information or whatever it might be? You can really get a good sense of that by looking at the comments, and engaging with people in the comments is a great way to do that as well.
No, that's true. It gives you real insights into the audience. So based on those comments or those questions or whatever the interaction is about, you have a feel for, okay, I have to explain a little bit more about this genre because this audience isn't familiar with this genre, for
Right.
example. Or I'm not going to get into the technology of how I set up my mic and stuff like that because they never get into tech.
Yeah.
That's just going to scare them away.
And if tech isn't what I want to talk about, then I don't pitch myself to platforms where what they're
for sure.
primarily talking about is tech.
Yeah, it's like I plug in the USB and I record.
Exactly. That's about as much tech as I'm interested in delving into. Yeah, and I think that especially if, as would be the case for many authors, you have a topic that is evergreen, then don't do that chunk of work just once. Have a tickler list so that maybe every year on the anniversary of when that episode aired, maybe give it a quick listen to make sure that it's still going to be offering value a year later and promote it again, especially if that person is still active in some way and you are helping to continue to provide value to their listeners, continue to get the word out about them and their podcast by re-promoting your episode.
No, that is, I like that. The anniversary elements are pretty cool.
And the thing that I would advise people in terms of amplifying your appearance is think of it beyond the specific reason that you pitched the podcast to begin with, and think of this as a potential colleague that you can have a wider ranging relationship with. And that means continuing to engage with them on social media, continuing to comment on episodes. Guess what? Even the ones that you aren't in. And you and I, I think met via each of our podcasts. And what did it lead to? It led to 2 co-authored books, among other things that we work together. We can't guarantee that you'll co-author books with your hosts, but there are all sorts of opportunities that you can benefit yourself and the other person if you keep that relationship alive.
Yeah, I mean, other things have come up where, I think you'd be great for this. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have to be co-authoring a book. It'd be like, hey, looking for a panelist for this topic. Are you going to be at this conference? Or, hey, you live nearby there. Is this something you can do? Because I know you'd be good at that. It's part of expanding your network. And just like in general in the author community, looking for ways that you can promote your fellow author. It's looking for ways that you can promote the podcast itself. Even saying, oh, Matty, I just talked to so-and-so. You really have to have them on your podcast. I think they would really be great for your audience. I don't know if you're planning on talking about this, but one of the tips that I really appreciated that you offered when we were putting the book together was the thought of, and this is something my wife falls into all the time, because she listens to only the celebrity podcasts, not you and I. And I'm talking about like TV stars, Hollywood people.
Uh-huh.
And it's, so Ted Danza's got a new show and he's on every other celebrity's podcast for 6 weeks straight.
Yeah.
And that's all you hear is the one guest.
Yeah.
That's something that can get somewhat tiring outside of Hollywood, right?
Yeah, I think that the time around a book launch is an obvious time for authors to want to book podcast appearances. And you do run that risk of, you've made a very successful pitch and you've landed appearances on 6 podcasts that are all related to crime fiction or whatever. And you do yourself and the host and their listeners a service if you have prepared a suite of topics that you can talk about related to that. So even if you're on 6 podcasts in a month, you can still be saying something different and fresh and new in each of those. That makes it not only interesting for the listeners who may be listening to all of those podcasts and don't want to hear the same stump speech over and over again, but it makes it interesting for you too, because you really need to go into every podcast as if this is the first time you've talked about it. You're so excited to talk about it, not kind of droning on as if it's clear that you're just regurgitating a bunch of semi-memorized script. I mean, I think it all comes back to the idea of providing value. What value can you provide across that whole spectrum of audiences? And you can do that by having variations of the topic you want to talk about that will make it fresh each time.
No, I love that. I love that concept because, again, if you're keeping it fresh for yourself, it's likely going to be keeping it fresh for the listener too. So if it's the same person, they can go, oh, I heard Matty on 4 different podcasts, but she talked about different aspects of this.
Exactly.
This tour she's doing. It's not like you have a set list and, I'm going to play this song and then right after that, I'm going to play that song. Right. I mean, it's a bit more dynamic than that.
Yeah. So is there any final tip just in general that you would want to share with people who are thinking of pitching podcasts?
Yeah, I would say don't forget to have fun. We get all serious and professional and you have these plans and goals and stuff. And yes, that is all very important, but remember to enjoy yourself. Think about it, Maddie. When I was young and I dreamed of one day I would be a writer and one day I would tell stories and people would listen to my stories. I never dreamed that I would actually be able to talk about what I do with such passion. And I take every opportunity I can to enjoy having those conversations.
Well, that is a lovely point to end on. And if anybody's curious, some of the tips we've been talking about are in our new book, The Podcast Guest Playbook, Turning Conversations into Connections and Community. I think we've hit several of those C's.
I love that you allowed us to have alliteration.
About alliteration.
Podcast Guest Playbook, and then they went to we minded our P's and C's.
Exactly. Well, Mark, always lovely to speak to you as one of the premier both podcast host and guest. You're always displaying your professionalism, preparedness, even when you don't close the shades, and your politeness. So please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Well, Matty, you can find me online at markleslie.ca, and there are links to my books, socials, all the things there.
Very much.
Thanks, Matty. Always great to chat.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Mark. What is a characteristic of a great podcast interview that you've enjoyed as a listener that you would want to recreate as a guest? Hop on over to the Indy Author on YouTube and let us know. And I did want to mention that I am not currently accepting pitches for the Indy Author podcast, though I sadly can't invite you to try out the pitching tips that Mark and I shared for that. But Mark is accepting pitches for his Stark Reflections podcast. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.